the legend was older than the kingdom itself. A tale told in hushed voices, passed from fearful lips to cautious ears. Deep within the black hollow forest, they said, there was a maiden, cursed, eternal, waiting. No one who sought her had ever returned. Prince Aldrich had always been drawn to forbidden things. The warnings of his council, the trembling whispers of the common folk, the shriveled old seers who spoke of death and despair, none of it frightened him. He was a man of logic, a ruler in waiting. Curses, to him, were mere stories to keep children from wandering too far into the woods. And so, on the night of the blood moon, he rode into the heart of the forest. The trees, ancient and gnarled, twisted into grotesque shapes under the crimson glow. Their branches clawed at the sky like skeletal hands. The deeper he rode, the denser the darkness became. It was an unnatural blackness, thick and suffocating, swallowing the moonlight whole. His torch barely pushed the shadows back, their inky tendrils seeming to move when he wasn't looking. Then came the whispers. At first, they were indistinct, a murmur in the wind, voices just beyond his understanding. But as he pressed forward, they grew clearer. Soft, desperate pleas. Turn back. She is waiting. She is hungry. His horse whinnied, its ears pinned back in terror. Aldrich tightened his grip on the reins, his heartbeat steady. A trick of the wind, he told himself. But the wind did not breathe in gasps. Something was in the trees. Watching. Waiting. Aldrich felt it before he saw it, an overwhelming sensation of being hunted. His torchlight flickered, casting elongated shadows that danced like broken marionettes. The trees groaned, their ancient limbs stretching toward him, and the air grew colder with each step. Then, he saw the first sign. A tattered red ribbon hung from a low branch, unmoving despite the wind. The fabric was old, discolored by time, but the moment he laid eyes on it, his blood ran cold. Every tale, every story of the Cursed Maiden, spoke of a red ribbon, a marker left by those who had vanished. And there were more. Hundreds of ribbons, swaying gently, tied to every branch, every bush, every twisted root. A graveyard of forgotten souls. His horse refused to move any farther. Its eyes rolled wildly in fear, foam forming at its mouth. The whispers grew louder, desperate, clawing at his mind. The prince gritted his teeth and dismounted, leading the trembling beast by the reins. A path lay ahead, carved through the thorns as if something had been dragged through the earth. The shadows along its edges pulsed and shifted, shapes barely visible in the corner of his vision. Something moved ahead. A slow, deliberate sound. Like bare feet dragging against dead leaves. Aldrich raised his torch. The flame wavered violently, the light barely holding the darkness at bay. His breath came short, his heart hammering. Then, just beyond the reach of the fire, he saw her. The maiden. She stood in the center of the path, motionless. Her gown was white, but stained with something dark that trailed from the hem like fingers reaching for the earth. Her long, black hair fell in tangled strands over her face, obscuring her features. But it was her posture that made the prince's skin crawl. She did not stand like a living thing. Her body was stiff, her arms hanging limply at her sides, her fingers slightly curled as if waiting to grasp something. Waiting to grasp him. Aldrich took a slow step forward. Who are you? His voice was firm, commanding, though his throat felt dry. She did not respond. The wind howled, and with it came a sound that made his blood freeze. A giggle. Childlike. Hollow. Not from her lips, but from the darkness all around him. Aldrich turned sharply, his torch sweeping over the trees. Shadows flickered, branches cracked. Something darted between the trunks, small, quick, a glimpse of a face with hollow, black eyes staring back at him before vanishing. Then, the maiden moved. It was not a step, nor a shift. One moment, she stood in the distance. The next, she was closer. Her head still bowed, her hair masking her face. Aldrich staggered back. The air around him thickened, pressing against his chest like unseen hands. His horse shrieked, yanking the reins from his grip and bolting into the night. He was alone. The whispers became laughter. Mocking. Hungry. Then, she lifted her head. Aldrich did not scream, but his body betrayed him. His knees locked, his breath caught, and for the first time in his life, he felt true, paralyzing terror. The maiden had no eyes. Just two black, gaping voids that stretched across her face like wounds carved too deep. Her mouth did not move, but he heard her voice all the same, inside his head, inside his bones. You came for me. The trees groaned, the sky darkened further, and Aldrich knew, he had gone too far. There was no turning back. Prince Aldrich's heart pounded as he stumbled backward, unable to tear his eyes from the Cursed Maiden. Her hollow gaze was an abyss, threatening to swallow his very soul. The whispers, once faint, now screamed in his ears, growing louder, more insistent. The air turned oppressive, as if the very forest was closing in around him, forcing him toward the cursed thing that awaited in the shadows. He wanted to flee. He should flee. But something kept him rooted to the spot, his legs trembling, his breath shallow. The darkness had its hold on him. Suddenly, the maiden began to move again, her stiff limbs jerking, like the twisting of a broken doll. She took a step toward him, her feet dragging on the ground, leaving a trail of unnatural cold behind her. The laughter, that same hollow, childlike giggle, echoed from the trees, surrounding him on all sides. Aldrich's mouth went dry. His mind screamed for him to run, to escape the forest and its nightmare, but his body refused to obey. Then, through the heavy darkness, he saw it. A faint glimmer of light. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir something deep within him, an instinct, a faint hope that there might be an escape. Without a second thought, he began to move toward it, his legs shaky but determined. The laughter died down as he pushed forward, but the whispering never ceased. The light led him to a massive structure, a towering castle that loomed from the shadows, its stone walls covered in a thick layer of moss and decay. The air around it felt thick with age, as if the castle had been forgotten by time itself. The castle of eternal night, the legends whispered. A place where the sun never dared to shine, where no soul had ever walked and returned to speak of it. As Aldrich approached the massive iron gates, his hand instinctively reached for the cold, rusted bars. With a strained pull, the gates creaked open, the sound of iron against stone scraping like a scream against his eardrums. The castle's door stood open before him, dark and inviting. He stepped inside. The instant he crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped. The air was thick, heavy with the stench of mildew and rot. The walls of the castle seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, and strange shadows danced across the cracked, faded tapestries that adorned the walls. A cold breeze swept through the halls, and the doors slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash, trapping him inside. Aldrich spun around, his heart racing. The castle's entrance was gone, swallowed by the same inky blackness that filled every crevice. He was alone now, completely surrounded by the darkness. The silence was unbearable. Help me. The voice was faint, weak, almost imperceptible, but it came from somewhere within the depths of the castle. Aldrich froze. His blood ran cold. There was something familiar about the voice, something that tugged at his memory. Who's there? He called out, his voice trembling in spite of his best efforts. A low, eerie laugh answered him, echoing off the stone walls. It was the same hollow, disturbing laugh that had followed him in the forest. His stomach churned. He didn't want to stay. He should turn and leave, but the voice continued to call. It sounded so desperate. So human. Please, come closer. Against every instinct screaming at him to run, Aldrich moved forward. His steps echoed in the silence, and the deeper he ventured into the castle, the colder it grew. His breath came in foggy clouds, and his pulse quickened with every passing moment. The shadows stretched longer, twisting and shifting, as if they were alive. He came to a large, open room, and his torchlight flickered before completely dying. He was now plunged into total darkness. Prince Aldrich. The voice was unmistakable now, and it sent a wave of nausea through him. It was the maiden's voice. But how? A figure appeared in the shadows before him. The faintest silhouette. At first, Aldrich thought it was just another trick of the dark, but then the figure took a step forward. It was her. The maiden. But there was something different about her now. Her body was no longer stiff. Her head was tilted unnaturally, as if she were examining him, studying him. Her hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark, two black pits that seemed to pierce through him. She spoke again, her voice like nails scraping against stone. Do you know what you've awakened? Aldrich opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His chest tightened, and for the first time, he truly understood the horror he had wandered into. The maiden stepped forward once more, and the shadows around her began to writhe, swirling and coiling like serpents. The castle itself seemed to tremble. I have waited for you, Prince Aldrich. Aldrich took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to move, but his body felt as though it were frozen in place. The air itself seemed to close in on him, suffocating him. You have come, to free me. The words sent a chill down his spine. He didn't understand. What did she mean? What was she trying to say? The castle's walls creaked, and the ground beneath him trembled. In the distance, he heard a low, rumbling sound, something shifting, something ancient awakening. He looked up at the maiden, his mind racing, and saw the faintest smile twist her lips. It wasn't a smile of warmth. It wasn't a smile of love. It was the smile of a predator who had waited centuries for her prey to walk willingly into her jaws. Prince Aldrich's heart hammered in his chest, his breath ragged, as the cursed maiden drew closer. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, like the rhythm of a funeral dirge. Each movement sent a wave of dread washing over him, but his body refused to act. It was as though the very air itself was trapping him, binding him to this cursed place. Her hollow eyes were fixed upon him, and he could not look away. The depth of those voids seemed to pull at his very soul, drawing him closer with an invisible force. He felt as if he were standing on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into an abyss that he would never return from. Do you see me? She whispered, her voice a cold, raspy whisper that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Aldrich nodded, though he could scarcely form the words to respond. His throat was tight, as though something heavy were pressing against it. He tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in his mouth, stifled by the terror that gripped him. Do you understand? She asked again, taking another step toward him, her movements unnervingly smooth, like a creature of the night. The prince wanted to run, to flee from the horror that was unfolding before him, but he couldn't move. It was as if his body had been paralyzed by her gaze, frozen in place by the sheer weight of her presence. He felt the darkness closing in on him, suffocating him, as though the very castle were alive and feeding off his fear. She took another step forward, and now she was mere inches from him. He could feel the cold emanating from her, the chill that seemed to seep into his bones and freeze his very heart. You came for me, Prince Aldrich, she continued, her voice no longer a whisper, but a low, melodic hum that seemed to echo in his mind. And now you must pay the price. Aldrich's eyes widened. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed him. The curse, the one the elders had warned him about, was not just a tale. It was real. And he had walked right into its trap. I didn't. Before he could finish, the maiden raised a pale, trembling hand and pressed it to his chest. The moment her cold fingers made contact with his skin, a surge of power, cold, ancient, and terrifying, shot through him. He gasped, feeling the air around him grow impossibly heavy, suffocating. He struggled to breathe, to move, but it was as if something was blocking his very lungs. Do you see me now? She asked, her voice growing louder, more insistent. Her fingers began to sink into his chest, as if she were merging with him, becoming one with his very being. In that moment, Aldrich finally understood the depth of the curse he had unleashed. The maiden, this wretched creature, was no mere spirit or phantom. She was something older, something far more dangerous. Her hollow eyes, the black voids that stared back at him, were not just a part of her physical form. They were a gateway, a portal into the very essence of the curse that had bound her for eternity. "I am the darkness that devours," she whispered, her voice now a hollow echo that reverberated in his skull. "I am the silence between the stars, the hunger that waits in the shadows. You were foolish to come, Prince Aldrich. And now you will understand." The air around him began to warp, twisting and distorting, as if reality itself were bending. The walls of the castle seemed to ripple like water, and the shadows stretched longer, creeping toward him like tendrils of a monster waking from a deep slumber. Aldrich's vision blurred as the world around him began to fracture. The maiden's hollow eyes consumed everything, the room, the castle, the very fabric of reality itself. It was as if her gaze was pulling him into her, dragging him into the depths of the curse. "I see you, Prince Aldrich." Her voice was a distorted echo, reverberating in every corner of his mind. "I see all that you are, and all that you fear. I will take it all." The ground beneath his feet cracked open, and a torrent of shadows erupted from the abyss, reaching for him with long, clawed hands. Aldrich screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, his voice lost in the void. His chest tightened as the maiden's grip tightened around his heart. "You thought you could save me," she whispered. "But it is you who will save nothing." With a final, deafening screech, the darkness consumed him. Prince Aldrich could no longer tell where the castle ended and the nightmare began. The air was thick with dread, heavy with an oppressive presence that clung to him like a second skin. His heart raced in his chest, the rhythmic pounding like the beat of a drum heralding his descent into madness. He tried to move, to escape, but his body was no longer his own. It was as though the darkness itself had claimed him, binding him to the castle and its horrors. Around him, the shadows shifted, undulating like living creatures. They danced in the corners of his vision, twisting and warping into grotesque shapes. Figures seemed to emerge from the blackness, humanoid forms, their faces obscured by the dark. Their movements were slow at first, as if testing the prince, but soon they began to move faster, faster, until they were a blur of limbs and twisted bodies. Aldrich's breath quickened, his chest tightening as the shadows circled him. He could feel their eyes on him, even though they had no faces. The air grew colder still, a biting chill that made his teeth rattle. He tried to move, but his legs felt like lead, as if the very ground was pulling him deeper into the abyss. The laughter, the same hollow, echoing laugh, rang out from all directions, filling his mind with terror. It seemed to be coming from every shadow, from every corner, surrounding him. And then, as if in response to the madness in his mind, the shadows began to move in rhythm. The dance had begun. Aldrich's legs betrayed him as the shadows pulled him into the center of the room, forcing him to move with them. He could no longer resist. His arms lifted of their own accord, his feet sliding in an unnatural, jerky motion. The shadows twirled and spun around him, their forms growing ever more distorted. The figures that emerged from the darkness no longer resembled humans, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of agony. Their mouths opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth, and they reached for him with clawed hands, their fingers stretching impossibly long. The prince's vision blurred as the dance continued, the shadows pressing in on him, suffocating him with their presence. He could feel the coldness of their touch, the chill of death creeping into his bones. His pulse raced as he struggled against the pull of the darkness, but it was futile. The dance continued, relentless, spinning faster and faster until the room around him began to spin as well. The walls seemed to close in on him, the ceiling lowering, the floor rising, until he was caught in an endless spiral of shadows. In the midst of the chaos, he heard her voice again, the Cursed Maiden. "Do you see now, Prince Aldrich?" Her voice was a soft whisper, barely audible over the cacophony of the dance. "This is your fate. This is what you have awakened." The darkness will consume you, just as it has consumed me. Aldrich's mind reeled. He wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but his voice was lost in the madness. He could no longer tell where his thoughts ended and the shadows began. His body moved of its own accord, jerking and twisting in ways that felt unnatural. He was trapped in this horrific dance, forced to spin and sway with the twisted figures, their laughter growing louder with each passing second. "We are the lost," the maiden's voice continued, now louder, filling his entire mind. "We are the forgotten. We are the souls trapped in this place, bound by the curse you have unleashed." Aldrich's eyes began to water, his vision spinning as the shadows closed in tighter. The figures around him pressed closer, their mouths open, their eyes hollow and empty. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, the stench of rot filling his nostrils. He wanted to tear himself free, to run, but the shadows held him fast, pulling him deeper into their cold embrace. And then, in the midst of the dance, the shadows parted briefly, just enough for him to see her, the maiden. She stood at the edge of the room, her hollow eyes fixed on him, her face contorted in a grotesque smile. Her body was no longer rigid, it moved, swaying like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The shadows around her seemed to part, forming an unnatural spotlight that illuminated her figure. Her eyes glowed, two black orbs that reflected nothing but emptiness. "This is the fate of all who come here," she whispered, her voice now a sing-song lullaby. "We dance forever, trapped in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to join us." The shadows around Aldrich grew more frantic, their movements more violent. He could feel them pressing against his skin, their cold touch seeping into his very soul. They were trying to consume him, to pull him into the endless darkness that had claimed so many before him. His legs trembled, and he could feel the weight of the curse wrapping around him like chains. He was losing himself. His breath became shallow, his vision dimming, the darkness swallowing him whole. He reached out, desperate for something to hold on to, but there was nothing. There was only the cold, only the dance. And then, for a fleeting moment, the dance stopped. The shadows froze, suspended in time. The laughter ceased. Aldrich was left standing in the center of the room, his body trembling, his mind shattered by the horrors he had witnessed. He could feel the curse settling into his bones, a heavy, suffocating weight. The shadows, no longer dancing, were now simply watching him, their hollow eyes empty, lifeless. And in that moment, the truth became clear. There was no escape. The darkness that enveloped Prince Aldrich was no longer just an oppressive force, it had become a living thing. It thrummed in the air, the pulse of something ancient and malevolent. Every corner of his mind felt invaded, every breath he took was thick with the scent of decay and death. His body, though no longer bound by the shadows, still felt their presence lingering, creeping under his skin like a cold disease. As he stumbled through the castle, his footsteps echoed unnaturally in the vast, empty halls. The silence was maddening, broken only by the distant whispers that seemed to crawl into his ears, gnawing at his sanity. The once grand corridors now appeared distorted, warped beyond recognition. The stone walls twisted and groaned, as though the castle itself were alive, watching him. He reached the throne room, a place he had once known as a symbol of power and majesty, but now it was something else entirely. The throne, once golden and regal, was now a decayed husk, covered in dark vines that seemed to pulse with a sickening rhythm. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the heavy curtains draped across the windows swayed, though no wind could be felt. Prince Aldrich collapsed onto the ground, his hands trembling as he grasped at the cold stone floor. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing against him, suffocating him with its unnatural force. His thoughts were no longer his own. The memories that once defined him, his kingdom, his purpose, began to fade, replaced by twisted visions, flashes of horrors he could not comprehend. It started slowly. His vision blurred, his surroundings warping as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear. A low growl, deep and guttural, resonated from the corners of the room. It echoed in his bones, reverberating through his very soul. His heart hammered in his chest, but he couldn't move, couldn't escape. Then, the nightmare took shape. From the shadows, figures began to emerge, grotesque, nightmarish creatures, their bodies twisted and contorted into forms that defied nature. They crawled from the darkness, dragging their malformed bodies across the stone floor. Their faces, if they could even be called faces, were featureless, save for wide, gaping mouths filled with sharp, jagged teeth. They were the embodiment of Aldrich's worst fears, nightmares made flesh. He knew, deep down, that they were not real. But in this accursed place, nothing was real, or everything was. The boundary between the waking world and the land of nightmares had dissolved, and now he was caught in the maelstrom of his own mind, facing the horrors that had always lurked there. As the creatures circled him, their mouths opening wider, the prince's chest tightened. He could feel his body growing weaker, as though the very air was draining him of life. Each breath became a struggle, each heartbeat a painful throb. His hands, once strong and steady, were now trembling uncontrollably. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he could hear his own voice, whispering, pleading in a distant corner of his mind, begging for release. But there was no escape. The creatures leaned in closer, their jagged teeth glistening in the dim light of the throne room. Their eyes, black voids with no discernible features, stared into his soul, seeing everything, his guilt, his regrets, his deepest fears. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. The nightmare had him in its grip. And then, as if from nowhere, the Cursed Maiden appeared. She stepped into the room, her hollow eyes fixed on him. Her form was indistinct, her shape flickering in and out of focus, as if she were both part of the darkness and above it. She raised her hand, and the creatures froze, their twisted forms jerking unnaturally in place. "Do you see now, Prince Aldrich?" Her voice echoed in his mind, filling the space around him with an overwhelming sense of dread. "This is the world you have entered, a place where your nightmares live and breathe. A place where they are given life, and you must face them all." Aldrich's mind screamed in protest, but the terror was suffocating. His body was no longer his own, trapped in this waking nightmare, forced to witness the horrors he could never escape. The creatures, the grotesque forms that crawled and writhed in the shadows, were now part of him, each nightmare born from his own darkest thoughts, his own deepest regrets. "You cannot run from your fears, Prince Aldrich," the maiden's voice whispered, now a cold, mocking tone. "You can only face them. And in doing so, you will become one with them." The prince tried to force his legs to move, but they wouldn't respond. The shadows closed in, their eyes burning into his skin, their mouths gaping wider, closer. He could feel the weight of their presence, like hundreds of hands reaching out to drag him under. His mind was unraveling, each twisted image forcing him deeper into madness. "This is your fate," the maiden whispered, her form flickering like a dying flame. "You belong to the darkness now, Prince Aldrich. There is no escape. There is only the endless night." And in that moment, as the creatures closed in on him, Aldrich felt his soul begin to fracture. The world around him disappeared, replaced by endless shadows, endless fear. The prince's mind, already twisted by the horrors he had faced, had only just begun to grasp the true depth of the curse that bound him. In his desperate search for answers, he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. His feet, seemingly guided by an unseen force, led him through endless corridors until, at last, he arrived in a cavernous hall, its doors creaking open as if welcoming him to his doom. The room was bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. The walls were adorned with strange, arcane symbols, their meanings lost to time, but their presence undeniable. In the center of the room, an enormous stone table stretched out like a grotesque altar. It was covered in a thick, dark substance that glistened in the dim light, almost as if it were alive. Prince Aldrich's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. Seated at the table were figures, their faces obscured by shadows, their bodies gaunt and skeletal, draped in tattered robes. They moved in unison, their eyes hollow and soulless, fixated on the meal before them. The prince could not bring himself to look at the food that lay upon the table, but the stench was overwhelming, a mixture of rot, decay, and something far worse, a smell that seemed to gnaw at the very core of his being. He wanted to turn away, to flee, but his legs refused to move. His body, it seemed, was no longer his own. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of centuries of death and suffering. The prince's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse quickening as a cold sweat broke out across his brow. Suddenly, the figures at the table stirred, their hollow eyes turning toward him. A low, raspy voice echoed through the room, its words incomprehensible, but the tone unmistakable, a summons. "Join us, Prince Aldrich," the voice croaked. "The feast awaits." Aldrich's body, against his will, took a step forward. His mind screamed in protest, but his feet moved inexorably toward the table. The figures, their skeletal hands outstretched, beckoned him closer. The smell of decay was unbearable now, as though the very air itself was choking him. One of the figures, the one sitting at the head of the table, rose slowly. Its face, hidden in the shadows, was featureless, a grotesque mask of flesh and bone. The prince could feel its presence closing in on him, the air around him growing colder, more suffocating. "You are the chosen one," the figure whispered, its voice a chilling rasp. "The one who shall partake in the feast of the damned. You have come seeking answers, but now you will become part of the ritual. We have all been waiting for you." Aldrich's heart raced, his stomach churning as the figure's words echoed in his mind. He could feel the curse tightening around him, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. He looked at the table once more, and what he saw made his blood freeze. The food, if it could even be called that, was not of this world. It was a mass of writhing, twitching flesh, dripping with dark, viscous liquid. The smell was enough to make him gag, but he could not look away. His eyes, wide with terror, were locked onto the grotesque scene. And then, without warning, the figures at the table began to feast. Their skeletal hands reached out, tearing at the flesh with monstrous speed. The sound of gnawing and tearing filled the room, a hideous symphony of death. Aldrich felt the bile rise in his throat, his vision blurring as his body threatened to collapse under the weight of the horrors before him. "Join us, Prince Aldrich," the voice croaked again. "It is your fate. You cannot escape it." The prince tried to turn away, but his body refused to obey. His limbs moved as if they had a mind of their own, pulling him toward the table, toward the nightmare that awaited him. He felt the cold, clammy hands of the figures reaching out to him, their bony fingers brushing against his skin. The touch was ice-cold, like the fingers of death itself, sending a shiver through his spine. "You are one of us now," the figure at the head of the table whispered, its face still hidden in shadow. "You will feed, just as we have fed. The curse has claimed you, Prince Aldrich. And now, you will join the feast of the damned." With those words, the room seemed to close in on him. The walls twisted, the shadows grew long and dark, and the air grew thick with the stench of death. The figures around him moved in eerie synchronization, their hands reaching out, tearing at the prince's flesh, forcing him to partake in the nightmare that had begun. Aldrich's scream was silenced as the darkness closed in on him. He felt the cold, unfeeling hands grip him tighter, dragging him toward the table. The flesh, no longer simply food, seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, as though it were alive, waiting for him to take his place. He fought against it, struggled to break free, but it was no use. The curse had him now. He could feel his body weakening, his soul slipping further and further into the darkness. The figures fed, their eyes glowing with a hunger that seemed to consume everything, even the prince's very essence. And then, in the heart of the nightmare, Aldrich understood. This was the true nature of the curse. It was not just a curse of the body, but of the soul. The feast was not for the living, it was for the damned. For those who had fallen, for those who had lost their humanity. And now, Aldrich was one of them, bound to the cursed table, doomed to feast on the flesh of the lost for eternity. Prince Aldrich's world was falling apart. His mind, once sharp and focused, was now a fragmented mess of broken memories and distorted visions. The curse had twisted his perception, and the horrifying images from the feast of the damned still clung to him, lingering like a persistent nightmare that wouldn't let him awake. His body felt like it was no longer his own, and the darkness that surrounded him seemed to breathe with malevolent intent. In the depths of the cursed castle, where reality itself had become as warped as his thoughts, he stumbled upon a room he hadn't seen before, a chamber hidden deep within the walls. The door, cracked and covered in strange symbols, creaked open at his touch, revealing an unsettling sight. The room was circular, its walls lined with mirrors, each one framed in ornate gold, but tarnished with age and neglect. The mirrors, however, were not the usual polished glass. They seemed wrong, as if they were windows to another realm, showing reflections that didn't match reality. A large mirror stood at the center of the room, its surface cracked, as though it had been shattered long ago but somehow held together by unseen forces. Its edges were sharp and jagged, like broken glass, and its reflection twisted in unnatural ways, warping the world around it. The prince could feel the pull of it, the need to look into its depths, to see what it revealed. He took a hesitant step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment he gazed into the cracked surface, he felt it, a sharp, biting cold that seemed to pierce his very soul. The reflection that stared back at him was not his own. His face was distorted, pale and gaunt, with eyes that burned with a deep, unholy light. But worse yet was the reflection behind him, an image of the Cursed Maiden, her hollow eyes glowing with an otherworldly hunger. The prince's breath caught in his throat. The maiden's presence was suffocating, her very being exuding a darkness so thick it felt as though the room itself was drowning in it. But it was the truth in her eyes that terrified him, the truth that was reflected in the shattered glass. The reflection of the prince and the maiden shifted unnaturally, as if the mirror were showing a time long past, a time when Aldrich had been nothing but a mere pawn in the curse's twisted game. His heart raced as the reflection of the maiden moved closer, her mouth opening slowly, revealing a sharp, wicked grin. "You see now, Prince Aldrich," her voice echoed, but it wasn't just a voice, it was a feeling, a presence that reverberated through the very core of his being. "The truth has always been within you. The curse is not something you have been forced into, it is something you have chosen. Your soul was bound to this castle long before you ever stepped foot here. You are the key to the horror, the one who gave it life." Aldrich recoiled, his mind racing. The words felt like a strike to the chest, a blow that left him breathless. He knew, deep down, that she was speaking the truth. His memories, those fragments he could still cling to, began to piece together, revealing the terrifying reality he had been too blind to see. His family, his kingdom, had once been ruled by a lineage cursed for centuries. His ancestors had been responsible for the suffering of the Cursed Maiden, whose soul had been shattered by betrayal, condemned to live an eternity of agony within the confines of the forbidden forest. Her curse, which had once seemed like a mere myth, had always been intertwined with his own fate. The prince had unknowingly been bound to her, just as she had been bound to the castle. Aldrich's knees buckled as the weight of the revelation crashed down on him. He had been nothing more than a vessel for the curse to continue. The darkness, the horror, it had all been set in motion long ago by his own bloodline. He was the heir to a throne built on betrayal, and now, the curse was claiming him as its final victim. "You wanted to free her," the maiden's voice whispered, "but in doing so, you sealed your own fate. The curse was never meant to be broken, Aldrich. It was meant to be inherited. Passed down, just as the suffering has been." The prince staggered back, his mind spiraling as the reflection in the shattered mirror shifted again. It no longer showed him as he was, but as something monstrous, a twisted version of himself, his eyes darkened by the same hollow emptiness that consumed the maiden. He could see the future, a future where his body, now tainted by the curse, would decay, his soul trapped in the endless nightmare for all eternity. The prince's hands trembled as he reached out to touch the cold glass of the mirror. But as his fingers made contact, a surge of energy shot through him, and the reflection of the maiden smiled wickedly. The mirror cracked further, shards breaking free and swirling around him like a whirlwind of darkness. "You cannot escape the truth, Prince Aldrich," she hissed. "You were always meant to be mine. And now, we are one." The glass shattered completely, sending the prince stumbling backward. He cried out, but his voice was drowned out by the deafening sound of glass breaking, of reality itself splintering into 1,000 pieces. The room spun around him, the mirrors warping and twisting as his world came undone. The Cursed Maiden's laughter echoed through the shards, a sound that seemed to stretch on forever, drowning out all hope. Prince Aldrich fell to his knees, his body racked with pain as the curse fully took hold of him. His vision blurred, the walls around him seemed to melt away, and he realized with a sickening certainty that he was no longer in control. The curse had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. And now, he was trapped within its dark embrace. The reflection that stared back at him from the shattered mirror was no longer a mere image, it was a part of him. A part of the darkness that would consume him for eternity. The prince could feel it, the soul-crushing weight of his fate tightening around him like an iron vice. His once regal posture was now slumped, his body trembling with the agony of the curse that consumed him. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost to the oppressive silence that enveloped the castle. His skin crawled as if it no longer belonged to him, his limbs twitching involuntarily as if they were being controlled by some unseen force. Prince Aldrich's heart, which had once beat with the strength of a proud and noble ruler, now thudded weakly in his chest, as though it were being dragged through the depths of the abyss. His breath came in shallow gasps, and the air around him grew thicker, colder, suffocating. He stumbled through the castle, his movements jerky and erratic, his mind a fractured mess of fear and despair. The curse had fully taken hold of him now, and he felt the very essence of his being unraveling. It was no longer just his body that was bound to the curse, it was his soul. He could feel her, the maiden. Her presence was no longer a distant whisper in his mind. She had woven herself into the very fibers of his being. Her thoughts, her desires, her agony, it was all a part of him now. He could feel her soul, a cold and hollow void, seeping into his own, drowning him in her pain. Aldrich's vision blurred as he staggered into the throne room, the place where his destiny had been sealed long ago. The throne, once a symbol of his family's power, now seemed like a grotesque mockery of everything he had once been. He collapsed to his knees before it, his body shaking violently as the curse consumed him from the inside out. The prince's reflection in the polished floor was distorted. He saw himself, but it wasn't him anymore. His face had become pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. But what terrified him most was the flicker of the maiden's face that briefly flashed over his own, a grotesque overlay of her decayed features, her eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. His thoughts, his memories, they no longer felt like his own. They were fragments of the maiden's life, pieces of her torment, her suffering, her eternal longing for revenge. Her curse had been passed down through generations, and now, it had come full circle. He was the vessel for her vengeance. Suddenly, he felt the chilling sensation of her fingers running across his skin. The prince recoiled, but the sensation remained, icy, clammy, like death itself touching him. The maiden's soul had entwined with his own, her dark influence suffusing every part of him. His body was no longer his own. He was her puppet, her vessel, her unwilling servant in the eternal darkness. "You are mine now," the voice whispered in his mind, her words like ice scraping against his soul. "You thought you could save me, but you've only condemned yourself. Your body is mine, and my soul is now yours. Forever." Aldrich's mouth opened, but no words came out. His body moved without his consent, rising from the floor as if compelled by some force beyond his control. He stumbled toward the grand mirror that hung above the throne, its surface reflecting a terrible truth. The prince's eyes widened as he saw what he had become. His once noble features were gone, replaced by the decaying visage of the Cursed Maiden. Her hollow eyes stared back at him, her face contorted in eternal torment. But it wasn't just her image that plagued him, it was the overwhelming sense of loss, of being consumed by an insatiable hunger, a thirst for vengeance that had no end. He was her now. The prince's breath came in ragged gasps as he realized the terrible, soul-shattering truth, his body was no longer his own. It was the maiden's, her cursed form having taken root within him. His soul, once proud and filled with the potential of a great ruler, was now shackled to hers. He had become the very thing he had feared, a puppet to the curse, an unwilling vessel for her torment. As the prince's consciousness began to fade, he felt the maiden's soul fully inhabit his body. The once clear thoughts of Prince Aldrich dissolved, replaced by her twisted desires and ancient sorrow. His eyes, now as empty and soulless as hers, flickered with the cold, dead hunger of the cursed. He opened his mouth, but the words that escaped were not his own. "I am the Cursed Maiden, and now, I shall reign." The room seemed to warp around him, the darkness closing in as if the very castle was alive, feeding on his torment. The prince's body, her body, rose from the ground, but it was no longer the noble prince who had entered the cursed forest. It was a monster, a twisted reflection of the maiden, a soul bound to an eternity of suffering. In the shadows of the throne room, a voice echoed, the voice of the Cursed Maiden, her laughter rising like a terrible wind, cold and cruel. "The curse is eternal, Prince Aldrich. And now, it has claimed you, as it claimed me. Together, we shall reign as one, cursed, soulless, and eternal." The prince's mind, now a hollow shell, was no more. The maiden's soul had claimed it, and with it, her vengeance was complete. The curse had passed from one to the other, and now, in the castle of eternal night, the prince and the maiden were one, trapped in an endless cycle of torment and darkness. And so, the legend of the Cursed Maiden continued, now with a new twist, a new horror, the prince's body, the maiden's soul, forever entwined in the cursed castle, bound to an eternity of suffering.